today I have another fun project. This one is involving a 1973 Mustang Grande, and the Mustang Grande is located in Poland. We have a fellow enthusiast and friend of ours who purchased the Grande Mustang from a used car dealer in Massachusetts. He had it shipped to Poland, and when it showed up, it turned out that it doesn't have the original engine or transmission. Instead, somebody dropped in a 1985 5.2 liter V8 with an automatic overdrive transmission. Clearly, there are many years between the 73 and the 85 models that we've been dealing with. The biggest difference between 1973 and 1985 5-liter V8s is that 1973 used ignition points and condenser electromechanical ignition system. 1985 used a computer-controlled ignition system. 1973 used a carburetor for the air-fuel intake for the engine. 1985 had fuel injection. 1973 had a mechanical fuel pump on the engine that pulled gasoline from the fuel tank in the rear of the car forward and pushed it up toward the carburetor. 1985, the fuel injection system uses an electric fuel pump mounted inside the fuel tank that draws the gasoline out and pushes it all the way forward to the fuel injection system. Now, there's a reason I'm going about the difference between these two cars. That's because the way that the car showed up in Poland is not set up to run properly. Mr. Z, who owns the Mustang now, was able to crank the engine over at the starter relay, but not with the ignition key. And when he cranked it over, if he primed the carburetor on the engine, it would fire off, but then it would die. And yes, I said carburetor. Somebody replaced the fuel injection system with the carburetor, which is fine. Carburation works wonderfully well. So he got a hold of me and asked me if he could pass some questions by me. Sure, absolutely. And when he started telling me about the mixture of 1985 technology and 1973 Mustang, I knew a couple of things immediately. First of all, I had him take a bunch of photographs of different parts of wiring for his car. And part of that wiring showed me a 4-plug receptacle in the main harness that matched this kind of plug. And I was able to see by the color of the plug wires that it was the vehicle harness socket for the neutral safety switch and backup light. Normally it would connect to a plug, 4 wires, going to a neutral safety switch mounted on the side of the transmission. Wasn't there. So that's why he's not able to crank using the ignition key, because there was no neutral safety switch. So in a previous video, just to recap it real quick, I went ahead and got a C4 neutral safety switch, and I got a pigtail for an automatic overdrive or AOD transmission neutral safety switch. I spliced them together so that he can take this cable, plug the one end into his harness and the other into the neutral safety switch on the AOD transmission, and I have a new one of those also for him. And his engine, as long as the rest of the wiring is in good shape, should crank over with the ignition key. So that was part of the battle. The next part of the battle was figuring out why the engine would fire off and then die. I suspected that it was a fuel problem. So after going around a few times with some questions and answers and looking at different pictures, I had him trace the fuel line from the fuel tank all the way forward to the carburetor. And it turns out that the fuel line does not have a fuel pump. No electric fuel pump in the back of the car, and the 5.2 liter engine, there's a cover plate over the part of the engine that normally a mechanical fuel pump is located. So that's why he wasn't able to keep the engine running. He puts in a little gasoline, fires it up, it burns off real quick, it has no more gasoline, it stops running. So I had a couple of choices. I could either suggest that he get a mechanical fuel pump and mount it on the engine and see if that would work, but I was concerned that because the 5.2 liter used fuel injection and electric fuel pump, that the eccentric at the end of the camshaft that normally wobbles around and makes a fuel pump operate may not be there. So what I suggested to him is we get an electric fuel pump and mount it in the rear of the car, and just like the fuel-injected version of 85 Mustang, push the gasoline forward from the fuel tank. But there's a few issues to consider. The first is picking the correct type of electric fuel pump. We don't need one that puts out 60 or 70 psi pressure, because this is not a rail fuel injection system. All we needed to do was have between 4 and 10 psi pressure. That was it. And we don't need a fuel pump that will produce 20 gallons a minute. So what I wound up getting was Holly. Part number is 12427. It is a fairly quiet electric fuel pump. It comes with mounting brackets and instructions, and it has 2 wires, red for power, black for ground. Very, very easy to install. And with my experience with these things, it will be quiet. It may not be as quiet as not having it, but he's not going to hear a constant rat-a-tat-tat-tat whenever he's driving. So, what could be wrong with having an electric fuel pump? Well, 2 things. First of all, this particular fuel pump, it will produce up to a maximum, I think it was 7 psi. Well, just in case something were to go amiss and the fuel pump started to put out more than 7 psi for any reason, I suggested we get a pressure regulator to put between the fuel pump and the front of the car. And then we could adjust this for a maximum of 7 psi, so if the pump ends up producing more for some reason, this will keep it from sending so much pressure to the carburetor that it overwhelms the needle and seat and causes the carburetor to run too rich. So that's the one thing I felt we should do. Now then, whenever we have an electric fuel pump, there is always this opportunity of a problem where the engine stops running, maybe the car got in an accident, who knows what, and there might be a fuel leak. Well, if the fuel leak is on the far side of the pump, and that power is still going to the electric pump, it was spitting out gasoline, and now we have a fire hazard. So what I suggested we do is we get a fuel shutoff valve. And what this does is it will be screwed into an adapter, and anytime there's oil pressure, 15 pounds of pressure or higher, it will allow electricity to flow from a positive input through an output that then feeds the electric fuel pump. So if the engine gets shut off for some reason, the electric fuel pump stops running. Oh, but wait, what about when we're cranking the engine to start it up? We need to have the electric fuel pump working then, don't we? Well, maybe. If the carburetor is not full of fuel, then yes, we need to have fuel in that carburetor. So they have another terminal on here that connects to the starting relay primary wire. So we can connect that, and anytime the engine is cranking over, it will also send power to the electric fuel pump. So during cranking, this will be pushing out gasoline, and anytime we have 15 pounds or more of oil pressure with the engine running, it will go ahead and send out gasoline. Now, in order to hook this up to the engine, those 351s and 302s back then had what's called a standoff adapter. And what the standoff adapter does is one end screws into the engine block, and the other end we screw in an oil pressure sending unit. Well, what we can do with this device is we can still use the sending unit there and here, but this has a hole drilled on the top and tapped that will fit this fuel shutoff switch. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put this together for him before we ship it. One less thing for him to have to worry about. But that is in large part what we've got going on now. We have some other steps to take also. The fuel pump comes with a fuel filter that has one nipple for fuel line, but it doesn't have it for the other end of the fuel pump. So I purchased some adapter fittings. One would go into the fuel pump and be used for the inlet. The other two go into a pressure regulator, or it's in a box, for the input and the output, where rubber fuel line goes into each. And we don't want to use any more rubber fuel line than we absolutely have to. The steel fuel line that came with the car is used to transport the majority of gasoline from the rear to the front. And the fuel regulator, I went up close to the front of the engine also. And the reason for that is I don't want to have to worry about running a starter relay wire to the shutoff switch, plus a power line to the shutoff switch, and get things confused. What I prefer to do is to have the shut-off switch wired under the hood, which it has to be with the engine anyway, and the wire from a switched 12-volt source under the hood. And it's easy to get to those wires. I'll show how to do that. And then one wire running from this terminal on the shut-off valve all the way back to the fuel pump. The regulator takes no electrical connection. It is simply a spring with a relief bypass. That's all it is. And so we can put this almost anywhere that we need to. Under the hood is where I think I'm going to be putting it instead of in the back. We'll see. I'll look for some mounting spots. So anyway, I'm going to do some pre-assembly. In a few moments, I'll put that on recording also, but I do need to get some things set up. So I will have Linda stop the recording and we'll be back in a moment. Part of the work that Mr. Z will be doing once this package gets to Poland is going to involve doing some electrical connections. So what I'm going to do to help him be better prepared to do good connections is I will send him some of these butt-in connectors that are insulated with shrink wrap plastic. Now, he could use regular crimpers or pliers and probably do a pretty good job of this. But when I bought these connectors, I purchased from the same seller a special crimping tool that in an earlier video I showed how to use. And it will handle red color insulated butt-in connections, blue or yellow, which are for different gauges or thicknesses of wire. And this did a great job for me the other day when I did an earlier video. Well, those looked awfully familiar, and so I did some digging around, and in my toolbox I found, by golly, I already have a set. Exactly the same, a different brand name, different color handles, but everything else is exactly the same. Well, that caused me to wonder, why did I end up getting two? Well, because I forgot I got the one years ago. Well, there had to be a bigger reason. It was because I knew that someday, somewhere, somehow, I was going to come across someone who would need to have some at least as bad as me. So, Mr. Z, I'm going to send to you this Wirefly crimping pliers to use with the terminals and connectors I'll be sending to you also. My gift as an American Mustang lover to a Mustang lover who happens to live in Poland. And I get to help get his car running. So I'll package this thing up real nice. I'll send it to you. It is yours to keep. I have another one. And I hope that every time you use it, you think of that crazy American guy who thought he'd help work on a Mustang from the other side of the world. There you go. Now, for what we're going to do now, I have taken the electric fuel pump out of its package. And I then opened up the instructions. That's right, I read the directions with these things. It's always a good thing to do. What I wanted to know in the instructions wasn't so much the technical details of the specifications. I wanted to know, first of all, which way does the gasoline flow? And it turns out that on the back, near the bottom base, there's an arrow that points to the direction the fuel is flowing. where the front is toward the engine and the back is toward the gasoline tank. Okay, but that was one thing that I needed to know. The other was, once I know which way the gasoline is flowing, they provide a fuel filter with this pump. Which end of the pump does it attach to? Well, the arrow shows a flow in that direction, so it's on the tank side of the pump we put the filter. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to find where I put the filter. Good luck there. It's around here somewhere. And then I'm going to go ahead and use some Teflon tape that is impervious to gasoline. It's a special type of Teflon tape that gasoline cannot damage. And I'll go ahead and I'll install that fuel filter. There we go, I found it. Just had to look around a little bit. There's also mounting screws included in the kit, but I'll leave that to Mr. Z to take care of because the Mustang isn't with me. So I take some of this gasoline impervious Teflon tape.
I can't see you, you're behind the thing.
And just put it around the threads. It doesn't take a lot. And then I just snap it off. And then I just kind of push the threads in. Now, if there are any pieces that are hanging off, I try to get them out of the way. I don't want those getting caught in the gasoline as this filter is filtering. So the inlet is uncovered now. So now I take a look at the direction of the arrow at the bottom. This is the end for the fuel tank, which is where the fuel filter gets threaded into. Now in a few minutes, I'm going to go off camera. I'm going to get 2 wrenches, one to hold on the flat sides of the back of the pump and one for the fuel filter. I'll tighten this in. I'm not going to make it super tight. It does not have to be run all the way to the bottom. It just has to be tight enough to keep the threads from leaking gasoline. And I will have it plenty tight for that. Now that begs the question, how do I hook up the gas line on the other end? Haha, I'm glad you asked. Because part of this kit includes a little tiny outlet that we thread into the electric fuel pump, and then it is responsible for sending gasoline forward toward the carburetor. And for this, I do the same thing. Gasoline resistant Teflon tape. Take a little bit. Put it on the threads. And it only takes a little bit. Snap it off. Put it back in this case. Then I'll smooth the Teflon tape into the threads. There's a plug in the end at each end of this pump that is used to hold in the oil that was made to manufacture it. So I'm not going to use that anymore. I just run this fitting into the pump enough to keep it in place. And again, I'm going to go off camera. I'll put a wrench across 2 flats to hold this. I'll run this down so it's tight, not excessively tight. If I make it too tight, I could damage the housing, and I don't want to do that. This is too nice a unit. And once I do that, we'll come back to camera. Now, I was not going to record me tightening the fitting and the fuel filter, but I decided, you know what could possibly go wrong? So I'm going to go ahead and do it. I'll start with the fitting. The two flats on the end of the housing are 7/8 of an inch. This is 7/16 of an inch, very small. So I put this on the flats. I put this on the flats. And take this one wrench here, I simply start to tighten, just like you might expect. And I only have to get a little tight, and I can stop. If I go too far and try to run the threads from this fuel fitting all the way down into the housing, I could end up cracking the housing. I don't want to do that. This is a nice piece of equipment. Now the next thing I need to do is tighten the fuel filter. Now we got a problem, because this fuel filter is almost 7/8 of an inch, but it's not quite 15/16. It's a metric size. So what I needed to do was get my adjustable wrench and use that to help tighten things up. So I'll first go ahead and get this snugly around the fuel filter. And then this one I'll get on the housing. And then again, I just tighten. I don't have to make it real tight. Again, just enough to keep it from leaking. If I make it too tight, I could cause a problem. So that is the assembly all put together for the fuel pump, electric fuel pump. Now next comes the fuel pressure regulator. Now this has instructions also. It's got a couple of parts to it I want to point out. It has an adjusting nut and adjusting bolt with a hex head in the top, and that's what we use to adjust the pressure when the fuel pump is operating. And then I've got an inlet, an outlet, and another outlet. This thing is set up so that it can feed two different devices if we had two different devices. Well, we don't, so I gotta plug one end. And let's see if that will fit. Nope, it won't. So I gotta get this plastic plug out of here. And I purchased a pipe thread plug to put into either of these outlets. And I have two inlet that I picked up also for fuel in and fuel out with the regulator. So let me think about something here. Oh, how do I know these are the outlets and that's the inlet? Well, because if you were to take a good look at the housing, it has the word in pointing this way, and out pointing in the direction of these two end pieces. That's how I know. Now I go ahead and get my hands on there we go. Fuel line adapters. There are 3 in this package. It turns out I only need two of them because one showed up in the Holly electric fuel pump kit. That was a very nice touch. I was surprised they did that. Not everybody does. There's my two metal inlets. And just like with the fuel pump at the other two ends, I'll put Teflon tape on these, put them in, and then run them down. I've got to find the plug that I purchased and put tape on that and run that down as well. I'll deal with these first. At some point, folks that watch enough of my videos will start getting bored with me doing these little tedious things on video. I don't do it because I'm lonely. I do it because there might be someone who doesn't know how it's done. And I'd like to be the person to be aware of that and do something about it. So I keep the tape on the threads. And when I have enough to cover the threads, snap it off. And then I just smooth the Teflon tape into the threads so that they'll stay. I'll put the inlet in first. I'll tighten the rest by wrench in a little bit. Now I've got to decide which of these two outlets do I want to use. So I got to think about this. This came with a mounting bracket, so it'll be mounted most likely to the inner fender well of the Mustang on the driver's side. Gasoline will come from the trunk. Gasoline will come from the back of the car. So this will go down and back. And it really doesn't matter which is used for outlet, but I think this one makes the most sense. So that's the one that I'll put the other outlet into once I have it taped up. Now, I need to find where I put that plug. I know it's here, I saw it. It's handling it a little earlier. Okay, we're gonna go off camera, I'll find it. Okay, I found the plug and I put Teflon tape on it, on its threads, in preparation for installing it in the second outlet port of the fuel pressure regulator to block it off. Now this takes a hex head Allen wrench to tighten in. I don't have one out here with me where I'm sitting. At the toolbox I do. I'm gonna see if I can get these tightened in. I don't think this is the right size. Nope, way too big. This one I can make into the right size. And just like everything else with pipe thread, tight enough is tight enough. If I go too tight, it could crack the casing. of the regulator. I don't want to do that. It's too nice a piece of equipment to be going around damaging. That should be tight enough for those. Now, I need to go to my toolbox and find a hex key this fits and tighten that up. And I am not going to do that on camera because that would be boring for some people. Okay, off camera, I found my Allen wrench. I tightened that plug in snug. This is ready to be connected back in Poland when Mr. Z gets these parts. The idea is to have this electric fuel pump fuel filter go to the rubber fuel line coming from the fuel tank. Then he needs to run a rubber fuel line from the outlet into the steel gasoline tubing that came with the car. Then in the engine compartment, he'll have the other end of the gasoline steel line, and he can hook that to this bottom barb using a piece of rubber fuel line. And then from the carburetor to here, he can put in the fuel line, or if he wants, he can put a fuel filter in between here and the carburetor. I know we have a fuel filter on the fuel pump already, but anything can happen between there and here. So my recommendation is to make sure there's a fuel filter in here before it goes into the carburetor. I will include these parts and their mounting brackets and mounting screws, and I'll leave it to you to go ahead and get this all connected. Oh, and gee whiz, how could I forget this? We have the fuel shutoff switch. Now we come to the fun part, electrical. Here, for the fuel pump, there's two wires, red and black. The black one, you simply need to find a hole or drill a hole somewhere in the underbody, not into the fuel tank, and get a small sheet metal screw or self-tapping screw and tighten this down. What I would also suggest is wherever you make that hole to drill, once this stuff is all together, put some silicone sealer on top of it so it'll help seal out water and other things that might cause that hole to corrode. At this end, I'm going to put on that small red butt connector I showed you a little while ago, and then I'll put some shrink wrap tape on it and make sure that this end is ready for you to connect to the wire that I need you to run from the back of the car toward the front so you can connect it right here in front of me to the fuel shutoff switch. Now this switch has some instructions. I looked for them. I saw them before. I don't see them now, so they got lost. I'll get new instructions for you to show how this connects to your electrical system. And I will include some shrink wrap termination ends you can use with wire, so you can shrink wrap those things to the end of the wire and slide them on these three terminals. These are 3 spade terminals. Very common, easy to use. You know, I was going to go ahead and set one more thing up. I almost forgot. How could I? got ahead of myself. I was going to go ahead and assemble the fuel shutoff valve with the oil sending unit extension so that you have one less thing to be concerned about when all this stuff shows up. All right, this is the oil sending unit standoff that is going to replace the one that's in the Mustang right now. One end threads into the cylinder block. The other end is screwed into the oil pressure sending unit. And this little hole is the one that I want to install. So this is a standoff tubing for the oil pressure switch. This end goes into the engine block. This end is where the pressure switch sending unit goes. And in this hole is where we will thread in the fuel shutoff switch. Now I'm gonna get some fuel resistant Teflon tape and put it on the threads and screw it together. I will leave it to Mr. Z when he's in Poland to unscrew his existing sending unit for oil pressure, unscrew his existing standoff extension, screw this one in, and he might have to take off this switch. It might be pretty tight in there. But when he's done, I'll need to have this sending unit put in with Teflon tape. I'll provide some, and screw back in the shutoff valve. So with that, I will go ahead, tape this thing up. Just a little bit, that's all it takes. Smooth down the tape, and in it goes. Now, of course, I put the wrenches away that I was going to use to tighten this, so I'll tighten this up off camera, and just like before, I'm not going to make it super, super tight. Tight enough is tight enough. And I don't know how easy it is to find gasoline resistant Teflon tape in Poland. Mr. Z will need this for his sending unit and for this end of the extension in this engine block. So I'll send it as another gift from America. Once I'm done tightening this up, I'll open up the hood of this Mustang R73 convertible. I will show under the hood the different wires used to go here to this shut-off switch for cranking and for running. And then I'll raise the Mustang in the air and show where I would suggest putting the wiring from the fuel shut-off valve all the way back to electric fuel pump. Now, the other thing that I'm going to suggest is we don't just take a wire and run it back there. I suggest after the wire has been run, you put it inside some very small conduit, just like I did in an earlier video with the neutral safety switch cables. It's very thin. It'll help keep the wire from rubbing against metal parts and shorting out years from now. And it'll look better. Now, just like Teflon tape, I don't know how easy it is to find this kind of conduit. So what I'm going to do, I have 50 feet in my one spool. I will see how much it's going to take to go from the front to the back of the Mustang. I will send that also as a gift, along with some wire ties, so that Mr. Z can put that together and make it look really nice. So I have a small gauge red butt end connector that is shrink wrap tubing encased. I have a spool of yellow wire I'm going to send to Poland, so Mr. Z has a wire to work with that I know is good. And I have a shrink wrap tubing already over the yellow wire. So I simply take the stripped end of the wire, push it into the red butt connector, and using the crimping tool, I crimp it. And then I check to make sure it crimped. Nice and solid. Now for the electric fuel pump, I have the red powered lead. I've got the shrink wrap tube on it already. It already came stripped, so I only had to twist the copper wire together. And then I put that wire inside the other end of that butt connector. And then I crimp. Once it's crimped, I check it to make sure it's solid. Solid. And then I'll use my heat gun to shrink down the connector, and then I'll put the shrink wrap tubing over that and re-wrap it yet again. I just want to make really sure I have a good water resistant connection there. Let it heat up for a few moments. Oh yeah. Okay, now I've got to make sure I keep that hot tip away from anything that might melt. That looks good. I have to let it cool off for a few moments. If I put the shrink wrap tube in place right away, it'll get stuck on there and shrink down. And I don't want that to happen yet. Still pretty hot.
I'm going to do the one on the red wire first because it looks like it got melted a little bit and made it tighter.
Yeah, this one, the very tip got
I would do that one first.
Shrank up a little bit.
Because you're going to do the other one.
I'm actually going to use a small cutting pliers and cut that end away because I think that's going to cause me some difficulty. So I'll see if I can run this down now. Okay, I'll heat the shrink tube up here and then let it cool off after it's done tightening up. Boy, that really tightened up nicely. And this is marine grade 4-to-1 ratio shrink tubing. And what that means, 4-to-1, it'll go down to 1/4 its diameter when it's heated up. And marine grade means that it has a heat sensitive adhesive on the inside of the tubing, and when it gets warm it liquefies. When it cools off it solidifies, and what it does is it helps to make this a watertight seal. Okay, that is nice and cooled off, so now I slip this over. And then I shrink that in place. Now, me doing it this way is overkill. I understand that. It's like I used to say in the computer industry, when I would do certain things, I'd make double sure that there was a fail-safe. It was called wearing a belt with suspenders. Well, I would go a little extra sometimes and use a staple gun also. Okay, we'll let that cool off. Almost dropped it. High impact plastic. It was revived.
You would have been burnt.
Okay, so the power wire leading to the electric fuel pump is now put together. I joined them together with the butt end connector. Used a shrink wrap tubing plus at one end, plus a shrink wrap on the butt end connector itself, and then another shrink wrap tubing at the other end. This thing will not ever leak water. Well, not under normal driving conditions anyway. So that is ready to go. And there is enough length on this spool of wire to run from the front to the back of the Mustang. So it goes from the electric fuel pump all the way over to the shut-off switch. And I will have a little drawing to show you which of these terminals go where. There'll be enough wire left over to go from the shut-off switch, one wire going to the starter relay, so when the engine is cranked over, it will send current over to here to start the pump. And when the engine is running, the other wire going to this shut-off switch will send current to keep it running until either the engine is turned off or for some reason we lose oil pressure below 15 pounds per inch per square inch. And when that happens, the fuel pump stops running. So we avoid a fire hazard. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Oh wait, what's this I found? Oh, Linda, you're so nice to Mr. Z. Okay, This is enough conduit to cover the wire running from the shut-off switch to the fuel pump, front to rear of the Mustang, plus under the hood, enough conduit to cover the wire going to the starter relay and the wire going to the 12-volt switch power. So another gift from your American friends. I'm gonna put some of these things on bubble wrap so they don't knock around while it's in transport to Poland. And you know what else I'm gonna do? I'm gonna provide some heat shrink tubing for you to use for your other connections that you're going to be making. You'll be making 3 of them over here, and at least 2 more, one for the starter relay wire and one for the 12-volt switch power wires. That's 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, did I miscount that? I put 6 in here? Yes, I did. I think I have a small bag I can put them in so they don't just jump around. I have a resealable bag here somewhere. We'll take care of it. We'll put you together. We'll take good care of you. And cut. Okay. This is looking underneath the hood of our 1973 Mustang convertible with a 302. And I believe that this is the same or similar to what Mr. Z has. He might have a 351, but everything will be the same. First of all, the fuel pressure regulator, I would put that somewhere in this area so that the gasoline fuel line comes up underneath, and then where the T is, that fuel line is routed over toward the carburetor. Make sure that you stay away from moving belts. As for the oil pressure switch, you'll probably have to do this underneath the car, because if you have power steering, the power steering pump will be in your way. So I'll show you that in a few moments. Meanwhile, where your fuel pressure or fuel shutoff switch is, there are going to be 2 wires you've got to connect. One will be used to crank the circuit over so the engine cranks over. Well, here is your starter relay, and on your starter relay there's 2 small wires. One of them will have the letter S next to it, and the other one will have a letter I. Well, it's the letter S that you're after. Red wire with the blue stripe. What you want to do is run a wire from this small starting terminal over to the fuel shutoff valve to the start terminal, which I will identify for you on a piece of paper schematic. You might have to get another nut so you can tighten it down on here and then push your connector back on for your starter relay activation wire. To get power while your engine is running, there are a few places you can get power from. You do not want to take it from your ignition coil. That would be a bad idea. The 2 places are either from your windshield wiper power circuit, or if you still have it, and I bet you don't, Circuit number 640 feeds a small solenoid that holds the throttle open when the engine is running, just to keep the idle up higher than the shutoff idle speed. My guess is because you have a 1973 Mustang and 85 engine, I bet that you don't have that circuit anymore. So what I would suggest is you come over to the windshield wiper motor, and I will sketch this out for you on a schematic also, so you don't have to worry about finding it. I'll show you right where it is. Your windshield wiper motor is back here. And in there, there's a red wire. And I think that red wire is circuit 64. I'll identify it for you. But you need to splice into here and tap power from there and get it over to the other terminal on your fuel shutoff switch. And that's what's going to power your electric pump most of the time you're driving. So the wire will go from here all the way to wherever this switch is underneath your... And please make sure when you run the wire over to here and over to the starter relay, please use that plastic conduit to help protect the insulation from rubbing through on anything metal. We don't want problems with these things. Okay, I'm gonna put the car up in the air and then I'll try to show you where the the oil pressure sending unit extension is located, where you're going to end up putting the fuel pressure shutoff switch. Okay, I'm down underneath our Mustang. There's our oil filter. This is our mechanical fuel filter. What I'll be wanting to look for is not on our Mustang, because we have a special instrumentation, but back in here around the oil filter you'll see your sending unit extension for the oil pressure gauge, or oil pressure light in your case. And that is where I need you to go ahead and disconnect and unthread out of your engine block your extension, put in the one that I configured for you, and make sure that the fuel shutoff switch is in place. Now I'm back at the fuel tank with the sending unit plug, the fuel outlet, and back up above the leaf springs you'll see a subframe. And anywhere in that subframe is where you could go ahead and drill in and mount your electric fuel pump. And then simply take a fuel line from here. Instead of going up into the metal fuel line on the car, you go into the input side of the fuel pump, and then you take the output side and run it up into that steel fuel line that will feed gasoline to the front. And I don't want to say it's that easy, but it's that easy. And as far as where you run the wires, I would say anywhere that you can find that you can suspend the wire with the conduit using zip ties from the back here all the way to the front. Stay away from the exhaust pipes and stay away from the rear axle housing. Try to run kind of along this same area all the way up front.
You're gonna have an issue.
You're gonna have to use... Well, this is how the garage looks at the ends of this part of the project for the 1973 Mustang Grande that is located in Poland. I have a few other projects I'm working on also, in addition to that one, but this is where I do all the work out of my garage here. We have a third car garage way under the side of that wall, and we have another house 2 miles away with another oversized 2-car garage where we store right now our 2 Shelbys. So it's enough to get some work done. It's fun. Oh, and there's all the trophies up on the wall that we've been winning at different car shows, and a collection of license plates from different states I've lived. Fun stuff.